It's an enormous privilege for me to welcome Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton here to the Kennedy Library today. It's been 35 years since I first met her at Yale Law School in 1969, where it was already clear that she was going to make a big difference in the world. In her student commencement speech that spring at Wellesley College, Hillary Clinton spoke of the challenges facing young Americans at the end of the 1960s, taking her inspiration from President Kennedy by urging her fellow graduates, and I quote, to practice politics as the art of making what appears to be impossible possible. As we all know, Hillary Rodham Clinton was elected to the United States Senate on November 7th, 2000. Since then, she's been a tireless advocate in Washington for the citizens of New York who've had the good sense to make history by becoming the first voters in the country to ever elect a First Lady to national office. But that's only the beginning. For much longer, Hillary Clinton has represented citizens throughout the United States and around the world as a powerful voice for freedom and democracy. And here at the Kennedy Library, we know a little bit about the extraordinary leadership a First Lady can demonstrate. Like Eleanor Roosevelt and Jacqueline Kennedy before her, Hillary Clinton transformed the role of First Lady into a position from which to inspire Americans to pursue their ideals and help the world to understand what it means to be American. Senator Clinton, you have devoted your public life to making possible what appears to be impossible. Your leadership has so many dimensions that I can't possibly do justice to them all in this brief introduction, so I want to focus on one aspect that I know the best, where you have had an enormous impact on the lives of millions of people, and that is your role in the global struggle for human rights. Like Eleanor Roosevelt, who dared to propose the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, you have dared to propose that the rights of women all over the world should be respected within the framework of that historic declaration. We'll never forget the courage you demonstrated as First Lady at the United Nations World Conference on Women in China in 1995 when you called for an end to the brutal but all too commonplace practices of denying women the most basic forms of freedom and equality. Quote, for too long, you declared, the history of women has been a history of silence. In your speech, you gave vital voice to the hopes of millions of women all over the world that what might appear impossible might tomorrow be made possible through the persistence of struggle and the art of politics. No person in your position had ever declared so powerfully as you did that day in Beijing that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all. As President Clinton's top human rights official, I was inspired by your leadership. Whether you were working for peace in the Balkans, helping refugees from Afghanistan, dealing with the crisis of AIDS in Africa, or finding ways to combat the exploitation of women and girls in Southeast Asia, you brought your practical optimism and expertise to domestic policy, to the international arena. And for those working in the human rights trenches, you provided direction. And for those millions whose rights were being trampled on, you provided hope. As you write in your wonderful best-selling memoir, Living History, you have drawn inspiration from the moral passion of Eleanor Roosevelt, and you have been moved by the quiet determination of Jacqueline Kennedy. I know I speak for everyone in this room and for many, many beyond when I say that your commitment to public service and the example you have set for all of us has made a difference in the lives of women, men, and children here in our country and around the globe. So we thank you for striving to reach what at first may seem to be impossible. To paraphrase President Kennedy, we thank you for showing us that instead of seeing things the way they are and asking why, we should dare to dream of what might be and ask, why not? And for all those reasons and many, many more, the Kennedy Library Foundation is proud to confer upon you its highest honor, the Distinguished American Award.
Good afternoon. I am absolutely delighted and honored to be here with you. And I thank my longtime friend, John Shattuck, for that very kind, overly generous introduction. But more importantly, for what he is doing now on behalf of this library, and for his service to our country as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. In that capacity, John Shattuck worked extraordinarily hard and successfully to end ethnic cleansing and the horrible impact of violence in the Balkans, to establish international tribunals to bring to justice those who had perpetrated war crimes in the Balkans and Rwanda, and then served with distinction as our ambassador to the Czech Republic. I also want to thank Deborah Leff, the library director, for her work and for this wonderful occasion, and to Paul Kirk and everyone associated with the foundation and the library in both full-time and what are supposed to be voluntary, unpaid positions of service. I thank you, because this is clearly a place that not only carries on the legacy of President Kennedy, but which does so much more. It is keeping both its focus on the past, as is necessary to educate future generations of Americans about President Kennedy, the years in which he served as our president, the legacy that he had left behind. But it is also looking to the future as well, with an educational program that is very successful in bringing people together as we are this afternoon. I'm looking forward to speaking with Juan Williams, and I have enjoyed my personal interactions with Mr. Williams, but I've also, as a longtime NPR listener, enjoyed hearing him on my radio. You know, I was thinking as John was introducing me that it is always a thrill to be here. I have been here as a private citizen and in my capacity as First Lady. And I was just pondering the rather unbelievable fact to me that probably the next time I'm in a presidential library will be next November 18th, when my husband's library is dedicated. So I know a little bit about the extraordinary efforts that go into creating this living legacy to a former president. And it's appropriate that we would gather here at what looks to be the beginning of a presidential campaign year to reflect on President Kennedy's goals and ideals for our nation. And I want to speak for just a few minutes about one of his dreams. It was not his alone, but he spoke of it and he acted on it during his presidency. And it is a dream and a goal that I believe should be once again on the national agenda. And that is the dream of ameliorating and ending poverty in our country. You know, President Kennedy once said that all our material riches will avail us little if we do not use them to expand opportunities of our people. And he later said, "A strong America cannot neglect the aspirations of its citizens, the welfare of the needy, the health care of the elderly, the education of the young." Those words could be appearing right now on the front pages of our papers or in stories on the television and in the radio. They seem so fresh and meaningful to us. Now, as much as that is a compliment to President Kennedy's enduring vision, in this case, it is also a critique of our nation's ongoing myopia about the responsibility to ensure that the blessings of America are passed on to all of our children. I wish that his remarks from so many years ago would seem quaint or old-fashioned, that they would be merely of historical significance and largely irrelevant, as now we can look back and thankfully see his comments about the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall. Those are now a part of history. But the ongoing challenge to ensure that American dreams are real, not just rhetorical, faces us today. And the urgency of the challenge that it presents could not be greater. You know, when President Kennedy said, "If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich," that is language not only of the middle of the 20th century, but equally relevant to the beginning of the 21st century. When he uttered those words in his inaugural address in 1961, we were at a moment of great hope and optimism in America. And we saw what a dedicated leader could do. First, President Kennedy, and then following with President Johnson to implement many of the goals of President Kennedy. But we know we have, after making progress for so long, turned away from that moral challenge. Robert Kennedy said in Athens, Georgia on May 6, 1961, "I believe that as long as there is plenty, poverty is evil." We've heard a lot of talk about evil in the last 2 years, and we've seen its face in a very close and personal way. There is no possible explanation for the kind of terrorism that we experienced here in our own country and which has taken so many lives around the world, most recently in Madrid. So yes, we do have to face the reality of evil. But there is another kind of evil that I think Robert Kennedy was referring to, and that is the indifference and the apathy to those in our very midst who are being denied and oppressed right before our eyes. Now, we have made enormous progress in many respects when it comes to poverty, its amelioration, and creating ladders of opportunity for all of our children. I've been privileged to know Senator Ted Kennedy for many years and now to serve with him over the last 3 years. And no one is a greater advocate for economic justice. And he carries on the legacy of his brothers, and in particular, the conscience that drives him to speak out on those who would otherwise be left behind. But as we meet in this beautiful library, we have to acknowledge that we've come a distance from those days and words in the early 1960s, but can we honestly say we have met the goal that President Kennedy set for us? 1 out of every 5 of our children born today will live in poverty. It's as though some have taken the scriptural admonition of Jesus that the poor you will always have with you as a commandment to enforce, rather than as a statement of conditions to be rectified. As Sister Pauline Lawley and others have pointed out, Jesus was making a reference to the book of Deuteronomy, which says, "Of course, there will never cease to be poor people in the country, and that is why I am giving you this command. Always be open-handed with your brother and with anyone in your country who is in need and poor." We will have the poor with us because we know we cannot, no matter how perfect a society we attempt to create, do away with all conditions that undermine people's hopes and aspirations and often create circumstances that are difficult for them to get beyond. But that is not an excuse, and it should not be one that we allow anyone in political life to get away with. Instead, we should be constantly striving to do better on behalf of all of our citizens. I was very proud of the fact that during the 8 years of the Clinton administration, we had extraordinary economic success, which, yes, resulted in so many people achieving wealth beyond their dreams. Millionaires, multimillionaires, billionaires were created in the economic energy of the 1990s. But we also lifted more people out of poverty than we had since the early 1970s. That was the good news. The less than good news was that the gap between the rich and the poor grew even larger, with earnings for the bottom 20% of Americans rising far less than that of the top 20% of Americans. But we were doing well, and we were on a path that, had we followed it, could have continued to create economic opportunities for so many. Unfortunately, in January 2001, a U-turn was done. The budget surplus and the opportunities that it provided to make investments in people, to create more jobs and pathways to success, was basically squandered. And we have been paying the consequences because we have seen people falling back into poverty who had been lifted up during the 1990s, and we have seen the gap between those with the most and those with the least grow even bigger. And most disturbingly to me, child poverty is worsening. Since President Bush took office, 55,000 more children have slipped into poverty. And today, if we compare ourselves to advanced economies around the world, we have the highest child poverty rate of the 17 wealthiest industrialized nations. And equally disturbing is that even work is not enough to guarantee a life free of poverty. A family of 3 with 1 working parent earning minimum wage earns $10,712 a year. That is more than $4,000 below the poverty line income of about $14,800 a year. It's easy to forget that half of all poor people work. I don't think most Americans know that. And even today, with the so-called jobless recovery, nearly 50% of people who live in poverty have held a job at least for some period during the past year. Why has this developed so that we face these statistics, we make progress during the 1960s, we fall back in the 70s and the 80s, we make progress in the 90s, and once again, we're falling back? I think it's because there's a fundamental philosophical or ideological conflict about the causes of poverty. Indeed, many in the current administration and on the right of the political spectrum argue that there is really nothing we can do to help alleviate poverty in our country, because poverty is caused by and sustained by individual behavior. The argument goes that a person's behavior determines success in life, and poverty is a sign of the individual's failing, because they are trapped in what is referred to as the culture of poverty. Now, those on the other side of the political divide argue just as vociferously that poverty is an economic problem alone, and that the difficulties are because society refuses to come up with governmental programs that will provide living wages and economic opportunities for everyone who is poor. As with many such arguments, particularly in Washington, both sides are right and wrong. And they pose what is a false choice for those of us who are citizens or in public life. Clearly, economic conditions affect poverty. During the 1990s, when we created 22 million new jobs in America, many people for the first time had a ticket out of poverty. And we know that government initiatives can make a real difference. The Earned Income Tax Credit lifted millions of working poor people out of poverty. Social Security has virtually eliminated extreme poverty among our elderly before Social Security and then before Medicare. The elderly in America were the poorest of all of our citizens. So these are major achievements that we can point to. But at the same time, culture does play a role. Too often, especially with intergenerational poverty, there doesn't seem to be any way out. Poor people lack what are called the soft skills of work readiness and self-confidence that are needed to succeed in the workplace. Many of us just take that for granted, but for many who did not have role models or mentors, those are big barriers to success in the economy. So how do we begin to sort out the arguments that in some ways prevent us from reaching a consensus about what we should still be doing with respect to poverty? Just because personal behavior may affect poverty does not make poverty solely a personal problem. It cannot be an excuse to wash our hands of the very dire needs that are before us. So what I would propose is that we try to break through the fog of poverty and find ways to attack it across a wide spectrum, using every tool at our disposal: the Earned Income Tax Credit, child care, housing affordability, transportation systems, access to college, encouraging marriage, child support, sex education, job training, savings incentives, promoting religious and moral values, health care. These are all parts of a solution that we were making progress on during the 90s, and we now have to get back to continue that progress. Now, unfortunately, it is not just a question of staying in the same place and treading water. There are many who are steadfastly and deliberately ripping apart the social and economic safety net. I find this very hard to understand, but every day in the Senate, I see another attack on the structures of opportunity and support that so many people rely on. How else to explain the commitment by this administration to turning the clock back other than to assume that they want government out of the business of trying to help people escape poverty? They're cutting vouchers to poor people who use them for access to housing, the so-called Section 8 program. They are unwilling to raise the minimum wage, despite the absolute convincing evidence that raising the minimum wage does not kill jobs. They want to take overtime pay away from millions of Americans, which will likely have the result of forcing people who are working and middle-income Americans to fall into poverty if they have their way. They're trying to cut Medicaid, a social safety net program particularly for children, which provides a lifeline to health care and often keeps people from either getting sicker and then showing up in an emergency room where they're taken care of often too late to really do what could be done for them, or forcing them into bankruptcy and impoverishment. And most confusing to me is the refusal by this President and Congress to extend unemployment benefits to the millions who have searched for a job but cannot find one in the economy. We are experiencing an oxymoron, a jobless recovery. And hundreds of thousands of people have simply given up looking for work. Last month, in February, there were hundreds of people unemployed for every one person who received a job. And we set a new record, not one I think we should be proud of. As of last month, America's unemployed have been out of work an average of more than 20 weeks, which is longer than at any time in the past 20 years. And yet, despite the efforts of Senator Kennedy, Senator Kerry, I, and others to extend unemployment, we've been met by a wall of resistance. First, because if we extend unemployment, the administration fears some people might begin to ask questions about the economic progress which they claim to have engineered. And secondly, as one of my colleagues said to me, unemployment benefits just keeps people dependent. Of course, unemployment benefits are paid into a trust fund for the purpose of helping people who lose their job through no fault of their own get through some difficult times. I always think when I hear people say that, they're talking about somebody else, not about themselves or any member of their family. So at the same time that we see these cutbacks to continuing to do what we know can work, at least in the short run, we have to ask ourselves, what more can we do? And I'm delighted that Senator Kerry has talked a lot about economic opportunity and about the kinds of programs and efforts that he will undertake when he is president. It's important that we try to come up with a bipartisan, even nonpartisan consensus about how to proceed. For example, if you've ever been forced to go into the search for help, looking for housing, looking for food stamps, looking for Medicaid, you know what an extraordinarily difficult obstacle course you must run. It sometimes seems that as you're poor, we're going to punish you. Because remember the culture argument. You're poor because you're not good enough not to be poor. So we create almost a hazing ritual to make it as difficult as possible. We could save money and assist people who need our help by moving toward information technology in all of these programs and trying to create a more seamless approach so that people could move into these areas when they needed help and then quickly out again. And the unemployment system could be what it truly should be, which is not only a safety net, but an opportunity to help people train and retrain for the jobs that we are losing, and what the prospects for employment might be in the future could be gauged and analyzed so that people could get help to fill the jobs that are available in their area. We also should do more to both promote and expand the Earned Income Tax Credit. Unfortunately, this administration wants to cut the Earned Income Tax Credit, and they also want to make it very difficult to apply for it. In fact, as has been pointed out several times, if you're a low-income worker who applies for the Earned Income Tax Credit, which gives you some money back so that you can try to get yourself and your children out of poverty, you have a greater chance of being audited by the IRS under this administration than if you are a multimillionaire. We should also expand the minimum wage. There is a long overdue need to try to bring it up closer to giving people the means to take care of themselves and their children. And many people on both sides of the aisle have begun to say that, but it's unlikely in an election year that we will see any action on it. And it's also clear that the best answer for poverty is a good job. But this administration has the worst job creation record since Herbert Hoover. And the number of jobs that have been lost are beginning to add up because people, as I said, are just foregoing looking for jobs because of the discouragement they feel in the workplace. We all know that President Kennedy said it well, a rising tide lifts all boats. And Jesse Jackson added this note, except the ones that are stuck on the bottom. By encouraging broad-based growth, we saw what could happen in the 1990s. We began to chip away at intractable unemployment in minority communities. And we were able to create a sense of optimism about the future. Unfortunately, this administration has only one answer for the economy: more and more tax cuts skewed to those at the upper end of income. And until we change administrations and Republican leadership in the Congress, that will continue to be their mantra. It doesn't matter whether it works or not. It is an article of faith. It is, perhaps one could say, faith-based economics. But while we look at what we can do to try to stimulate the economy, we have the debate in the presidential election led by Senator Kerry, we should not ignore the other aspects of poverty, because we then undercut the argument we're making about the role that government and the economy can legitimately play. Obviously, cracking down on child support is essential. Continuing to work to reduce teen pregnancy, and we had some good news about that last year. When I was in the White House, we started a private-public partnership, the National Campaign to End Teen Pregnancy, trying to educate young people, girls and boys, convincing them to be responsible and postponing sexual activity and early parenting. And we've made real progress there, and we have to continue to do so. We also have to recognize that in many of our schools, the promise of education reform held out by No Child Left Behind is being undermined by the failure of the administration to fund it adequately. And we are setting standards, which I support. We are trying to lift people's expectations, which is essential, but we are not giving the assistance to hard-pressed public school districts that they need in order to succeed. We also can do a better job in providing advice and mentoring to those who are struggling in the economy. I've worked very hard on microcredit programs around the country and indeed the world. Small loans that can make all the difference to someone who can start a business in his or her home. I was recently at a conference I hosted in Troy, New York, and a young woman who had been on welfare, first as a child, then as an adult, because of the prod of welfare reform, which I supported, which I think did give people often the incentive and even the push to look for new ways to consider themselves and their futures and to move into the job market, this young woman decided that she wanted to get some additional education about child care, and she opened up a child care center, first in her home, and then later, thanks to some small loans and some business advice, in a small business place. And she said, look, I never would have realized that I could be so independent, but I couldn't have done it without a lot of help along the way. So there's much to be done that we know works and we can implement if we have the will. That's what this year will test. I am, of course, unabashedly in favor of a Democratic administration. But it is not just a partisan comment. I believe that what is happening in our country and the decisions that are being made by this administration are putting us on a radical course that will undermine the quality of life and the standard of living for the vast majority of Americans. And that is deeply troubling to me because, as John mentioned in the book that I wrote, I talk about how fortunate I was to be born to parents who lived through the Depression and the World War II years, my father serving in the Navy, and then committed themselves to building a better life for their children. They were like so many other Americans of that generation. They understood that America has always done best when we keep our eye on the horizon, when we understand what the future expects of us. This administration has a very different view of American history and of the possibility that we can continue to progress together. They hold it sincerely. They believe that they're right. And it's difficult to argue with them because they don't entertain questions. So we are faced with decisions that are made on an almost daily basis that lead us back into huge deficits of $500 billion, which make us dependent on foreign lenders, such as the governments of Japan and China, to pay the interest on our debt, that will inevitably cause interest rates to rise, which will hurt everyone, but particularly those who will lose a job or an opportunity for a job and whose possible future will be constricted. They pass a Medicare prescription drug bill, claiming great credit for that achievement. But if you look at the fine print, you see embedded in it are problems for how we will even be able to afford the benefit, let alone continue to support Medicare. And today we open the paper and find out that the actuary in charge of Medicare was ordered not to share the calculations done within the administration, which demonstrated how much more expensive it will be. But that's not hard to believe, since many in this administration never liked Medicare to begin with. And they believe our country would be better off if we were all just thrown back into the marketplace and have to figure out how to fend for ourselves and afford whatever health care we could. In education, in the environment, in energy policy, on so many fronts, as well as with respect to our role and our leadership in the world. This administration is neither compassionate nor conservative. It is radical, and it is breaking faith with decades and decades of bipartisan consensus about how we are to proceed in the present in order to maximize the best possible future. Now, the people who will most suffer from this are not those in my generation, but my daughter's generation and those of you with grandchildren in their generation, because we are failing in our most fundamental duty to ensure that passing on the treasure that America is to those who come after us is done in a responsible, optimistic, and positive manner. I only hope that the majority of Americans take a look at where we are in the world today. And I talked about poverty because I still believe that we can't eliminate poverty, but we can limit it, and we can provide opportunities for people. And our failure to do so says quite a bit about how we see ourselves as a nation today. And this administration's turning its back on so many and shredding the social safety net says more than I ever could by looking at their actions, what their true intentions are. President Kennedy called a generation of Americans to service. He inspired countless people, not only here but around the world. And he did so because he embodied the American spirit of true compassion, of optimism, of positive energy put to work to solve problems. If you listen to what comes out of Washington at the highest levels today, it is more about fear, and it is more about fatalism, and it is not that same clarion call to action that has always motivated our nation. So for many, many reasons, it's time to put another son of Massachusetts back in the White House. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Clinton. That was wonderful. We appreciate your time and the effort. I want to let the audience know that people will be circulating in the audience to collect questions that you might have for Mrs. Clinton. We're going to talk for about 20 minutes to 30 minutes, and then we'll begin to go through your questions. So please look for the people who are circulating in the aisles and pass your questions to them. Mrs. Clinton, as I was listening to you and you were talking about the idea of this administration, the Bush administration, shredding the social safety net, I was reminded of the To America speech that John Edwards has been given out on the campaign trail. And one of the clearest divides between the Bush administration and Democrats at this point is the Bush administration's belief, as you mentioned in your speech, that poverty has cultural roots. That's why they believe in the faith-based initiative. That's why they believe in promoting marriage and putting money into promotion of marriage, rather than putting money, as you were saying, into Section 8 or earned income tax credits and the like. So it leads me to ask you if you believe that these cultural issues about poverty, especially with regard to women and marriage, are legitimate, or do you think it's absolutely bunk?
No, that's what I tried to say, is that I do think that there are cultural issues. I prefer to really think of them as individual issues. There are all kinds of barriers that individuals face, in part because of their station in life and the conditions into which they were born. And I don't underestimate those. And I believe that to ignore those elements of poverty is as equal a disservice to solving this problem as to pretend that there are no economic consequences of the decisions that people in positions of influence in both the public and the private sector face. And, you know, I'll just give you two quick examples on each side. There is no doubt that having a family that is intact, raising a child, has a better likelihood of positive outcome than the opposite. And anything that can be done to encourage people to be and act responsibly with respect to the real gift of a child is a very important issue. But on the other hand, you've got a lot of people who are working at minimum wage who are still in poverty. And many of those people are very dependent on some kind of governmental structure so that they're not taken advantage of at work, so that they are paid what they are owed. And you have an administration that wants to radically change the overtime rules. And by doing so, actually decrease the income that people will be able to count on. Those are the two kinds of conflicts that you see. Yes, there are steps like the Earned Income Tax Credit that can make a huge difference in keeping more money in the pockets of hardworking, working poor people. But there's also an important role for individual responsibility, and I don't think it should be either or. And yet that's the way the debate gets played out all too often in Washington.
Well, of course, the centerpiece, if you will, the Bush administration's domestic policies has been their tax cuts, huge tax cuts, largely going to the wealthiest Americans. But the argument that would come from the Bush administration is those are the people that pay taxes, and those are the people that create jobs. And obviously we're in a, as you said, a strange sort of recovery where it's jobless. We want jobs to be created. So what's wrong with tax cuts?
Well, I think that the evidence speaks for itself. President Kennedy had a very impressive program of cutting taxes, but the top rates were still what many would now consider confiscatory. And yet, during the 1960s, America began to boom. In the 1990s, partly because of the extraordinary drain on the economy of the deficit, my husband's deficit reduction plan raised taxes on the top brackets, and the economy boomed. So I know that Washington is sometimes viewed as an evidence-free zone, but it would be helpful if people would actually look at the facts. And we've had the first round of Bush tax cuts since spring of '01, and we still haven't seen the job engine kick in. We had a second round of tax cuts even after September 11th, which I found particularly irresponsible. And we still haven't seen the tax cuts kick in. So it really is a kind of article of faith with the administration, going back to supply-side economics during the Reagan administration. And in those 8 years of Reagan and 4 years of the first Bush administration, we quadrupled the debt of our country. And what Bill tried to do was to get us back into a position of fiscal responsibility, which we were able to do eventually after 8 years, so that we would have more control over our financial destiny. Because what we're seeing now are people not investing. These huge tax cuts have not resulted in the kind of payback that you would expect in the job market. And there's a lot of waiting and seeing what's going to happen. And so I think that there's a lot of evidence that we had a pretty good formula in the 90s. Always you need to be adjusting, you should be looking to the future, and we seem to have decided to take a U-turn back to the 80s.
Now, the Clinton administration, as I recall, were strong advocates of free trade. That's become a large issue in this campaign with the president's own economic advisor, I think, possibly mistakenly saying, maybe he was not so happy afterwards, that he thought outsourcing was good. It's just part of free trade. Well, if we look at the economy in those terms, international trade, lots of which were signed by your husband, what do you think about the idea of possibly now rolling back the clock and saying, we want some protections in place to protect people who are at the lower end of the economic scale, blue-collar people working in manufacturing jobs?
Well, this is, as you know so well, an incredibly complicated issue. And let me just briefly sort of explain how I see it. I do believe in the long-term benefits of trade. And I think we've been well served as a nation that tried to break down trade barriers and open up opportunities, both for our workers and businesses and also to try to create more global prosperity. What has happened in the last several years, though, is somewhat new, and that's why I think you're seeing the incredible attention being paid to this issue. We've been losing manufacturing jobs for decades, and we have continued to lose them. But in the very recent past, we've seen an upsurge in the loss of service jobs, white-collar jobs, professional and technical jobs. And so when people who are engineers or radiologists see their jobs being outsourced, then you have to ask yourself, well, wait a minute. We were told that part of the reason we lost all these manufacturing jobs is because We didn't have high enough value attached to those jobs so that they could be performed elsewhere at a lower wage. And we've been telling people for 20 years now, go to school, get more training, get one of these white-collar service jobs, professional and technical jobs. And now it looks like even these might be outsourced and leaving our national economy. So I think that's put the urgency into the debate. I think there are several things we should do, and we can do them without turning our back on what are still considerable benefits for our economy from trade. You know, first, we've never gotten our tax code right. We talk about it, we don't do it. We have incentives still in the tax code for businesses that both export jobs and fail to reinvest in America with proceeds of economic activity around the globe. We should be once and for all closing those kinds of escapes from responsibility. And there are big lobbies, obviously, that don't want that to happen, but that should be job one in dealing with these issues. Two, there are ways that we can provide some tax credits and deductions for businesses that will keep jobs in America. And several of us have proposed a 10% corporate tax cut for a period of time just to kind of stabilize the situation so that if it's a close call, the CEO is not moving the jobs but trying to keep them here. With respect to trade, at the end of the Clinton administration, we were, I think, getting it closer to right. The Jordan Free Trade Agreement that was signed at the end of Bill's term talked about enforceable labor standards under the International Labor Organization standards. And that was a move from what had been traditionally thought of as not the appropriate subject for a trade agreement. Instead of building on that, the Bush administration basically said, no, we're back to laissez-faire. We're not going to tell anybody how to employ people or what kind of pay or conditions they should work in or what the environmental circumstances of production might be. I think that's a mistake, and we should try to inject this into the trade debate more than the administration is willing to admit. But we also have to recognize that there are a lot of people who will continue to be dislocated because of the global economy, and frankly, there's no tax credit or trade policy that will either stop it or slow it down if it's something that individual businesses believe they need to do for their own purposes. And we have not fully constructed the right kind of safety net structural programs for people who lose their jobs because of trade. And I see this a lot in upstate New York because we continue to lose a lot of jobs. You know, we should make sure that trade adjustment assistance is available to service workers, not just manufacturing workers. We should really put more resources behind retraining programs and really mean it, not just talk about it. And so there are a lot of ideas percolating there. And finally, I'll just say that, you know, there's something you cannot write a law about. It's cultural. Because I always am amused when some on the right talk only about the culture of poverty. Well, there's a culture of entitlement among the wealthy and powerful in this country that also needs to be addressed. And it is time for a lot of our CEOs who grew up in this country, were happy to take the benefits of this country, often taking government programs like college loans, Pell Grants, and other kinds of opportunities, to recognize that they have an obligation to the people in America as well. And again, it's not something you write a law about, but it needs to change the culture and create more of an ethos of responsibility. This is a long-term problem, but I think we could do a lot more than we're doing, and certainly more than we will ever get out of this administration, which, you know, their answer to outsourcing was to announce an appointment of a manufacturing czar. 6 months later, they appoint somebody, and he'd already outsourced jobs to China, so it wasn't a very good choice for them to make.
Let's talk quickly about politics. I thought one of the braver aspects of your remarks had to do with getting to speak directly to poor people, and I would imagine a large sector of that are women who are often in those jobs, especially women who are single or divorced and trying to raise kids, struggling with life. How do you get those women and people who are poor to be involved in American politics? Many of them are extremely alienated,
Right.
so you don't hear politicians stand up and make speeches such as the speech you made, because when they're running for office, they're not addressing people who have economic difficulties in their lives.
That's absolutely right. I may be a little off on this, but I think that the percentage that turns out and votes among the poor is 38%, and among the wealthy, 68%. And there's a stark difference, and therefore, not only is it less likely political leaders will pay attention and do anything to help deal with the legitimate problems that the poor have, but the rest of the citizenry won't either, because it's not part of the debate. And many of the people who are most impoverished are single women, and particularly single mothers raising children. And trying to convey to them the importance of their political involvement when they've got so much else to worry about is a huge undertaking. But I and a number of other people are attempting to do just that. There were 50 million women who were otherwise eligible to vote in 2000 who did not vote. And when you think about that number and what they would bring to the political debate and the demands that they would rightly make on their political leadership, you could see the whole sand shifting in terms of what issues will we emphasize and what will we talk about. But if they're missing in the political equation, people are not going to pay much attention. So we're attempting to try to reach just that group you described, Juan, because so many of these women are, I think, quite heroic. When I go out and I meet women who are working the night shift in a hospital or a nursing home or some other workplace, taking care of kids. Sometimes one of their kids has asthma, and they make too much for Medicaid, but not enough to afford health insurance. You just think about the struggle that every day is, and it's to me something that we ought to be more respectful of and try to reach out and involve the issues that are on the minds of these women in a more public way, which I think in turn could perhaps inspire them to be involved in the political process.
Well, let's talk about politics a little more. I don't know if you happened to turn on NPR this week, but there was John Kerry in an unguarded moment talking about these people that he's running against as the most crooked, lying group that he's ever seen. And I was reminded of a remark that you made in a guarded moment, but I believe it was on the Today Show, in which you said, there's a vast right-wing conspiracy out there plotting against my husband and I guess against you as well. And I thought to myself later, I talked to Mary Beth Cahill, who's John Kerry's campaign manager, and she said, there's this echo chamber on the right that starts on the internet with like Matt Drudge and then gets picked up on the radio like Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and then rolls over onto the TV, and it's supposed to be a legitimate public affairs program, but it's all tilted to the right, and then the New York Times and the Washington Post treat it as if it's legitimate. Were you talking about the same thing that John Kerry was talking about when you said a vast right-wing conspiracy?
Well, I think it's quite descriptive of the reality. This is something that is also fascinating to me because I've actually read quite a bit about the genesis of this vast right-wing media interlocking network and infrastructure. And it was something that was planned and carried out over quite a period of time. Starting after the defeat of Barry Goldwater in 1964, a lot of those on the right who were anti-union, anti-civil rights, anti-Kennedy, anti-anti, decided that they had to create a new political reality. And they, to give them credit, have done a tremendous job. They have funded just a phalanx of these think tanks who churn out all of this, these talking points and opinion pieces. They have funded professorships and endowed chairs, and they have, of course, created an echo chamber in the media that carries their story no matter what it is, and is constantly attacking, Democrats and the people on the other side. Our challenge, and it will be Senator Kerry's challenge in this campaign, is to break through all that clutter. And I am convinced he can do it, because you can focus the attention of the country when you're running for president. But he has to just accept the fact that they will be relentlessly attacking him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's just the nature of the political system right now. And it's so fascinating to see what would have been huge stories had they been done by a Democrat, largely be one-day stories. I mean, I'll give you just an example. I think a lot of people were surprised to learn that Secretary Rumsfeld has a piece of the plane that went into the Pentagon in his office. Now, there may be an explanation for that, to be reminded of the fight against terrorism and the like. But can you imagine a Democratic president, Secretary of Defense, doing that? You would never hear the end of it. And there are so many examples of the double standard that operates. And we just, I don't believe in complaining. I just think you have to do a better job to get your message out and to counterpunch. And I think that is the signal that John Kerry is sending, that, if you dish it out, I'm going to dish it right back. And I think that's important, because that is the way that you convey the strength to take on this particular network of forces that stands behind the president.
When I'm talking with people in Democratic circles about the Kerry campaign, your name often comes up as people are looking for a vice presidential candidate. And you're already shaking your head. So does that indicate that you wouldn't accept it if offered?
Well, that is exactly right.
Exactly.
I will do anything to help Senator Kerry and whoever his running mate turns out to be to win, because I just think the stakes could not be higher.
Any women who you would put on that list? I know Janet Napolitano, who's the governor of Arizona, is considered once in a while, but not often. I hear Mary Landrieu, who's a senator from Louisiana, maybe even Dianne Feinstein of California. But given that for a while, it's interesting, the gender gap disappeared after 9/11, with more and more women thinking, we need someone to protect America, and therefore willing to vote and support the Republican Party. Now it's come back a little bit. But with a woman on the ticket, it might be a tremendous advantage for the Democrats. So who would you suggest, and who are you hearing?
Well, I mean, it's such a personal decision. I think that Senator Kerry has the same criterion that my husband had when he made his selection, which is first and foremost, do you believe this person could be president? Because especially here in the Kennedy Library, you have to be cognizant of the enormous burden that you assume with this choice. And I think that has to be the bottom line. Could this person, whoever he or she might be, step right in and lead our country in the event of something happening to our president? And then there are all the political calculations that the Kerry campaign has to try to figure out. But ultimately, it's a really personal choice. It's about qualifications and chemistry. And, I'm just going to let Senator Kerry make that decision on his own.
Now, one of the big issues, of course, in the course of the campaign is going to be weapons of mass destruction, and whether or not the president was sufficiently justified in terms of the intelligence reports in making the step to go into Iraq. Now, you spent last Thanksgiving traveling in Afghanistan and then Iraq. I believe you were there shortly after the president visited the troops. I just wanted to ask you where you come out on this argument about preemptive war.
Well, I think this is going to be and should be a big issue about the credibility of the administration. Here's how I come out, both looking backwards and looking forwards. I think that there was sufficient consensus among the people I consulted with in the prior administration. Obviously, that's where I went first, and other independent experts, that we could not account for all of Saddam Hussein's weapons programs, and that there was a general belief that he did have still some kind of storehousing of chemical and biological potential, and that he had never given up on his intention to pursue and obtain nuclear weapons. That's what I believed going into the vote, and what the president said in his speech in Cincinnati and what the administration briefed all of us was that he would take that vote and go to the United Nations to create a new inspection regime. And I could absolutely agree with that. And in fact, after the vote, they did go to the Security Council and by unanimous vote created a new inspections regime. But here's where we all part company. They apparently never intended for Hans Blix and the inspectors to be able to do a thorough job. And secondly, they never stopped hyping unproven allegations about the nature of the threat. And as a result, they began to undermine their credibility from the very beginning, which of course undermines America's credibility. Now, when we went into Iraq, the administration was laboring under some misapprehensions as to what it would take to create conditions of order following a military victory, and how we would be received by the general population, and how long we would be there at what cost. And you ask yourself, how did all this happen? Well, I'm increasingly of the opinion that the administration ignored many of the experts within their own government, ignored the work that was done in the State Department and elsewhere to help prepare us for what we would find in Iraq, and listened primarily to Iraqi exiles and defectors who had a story to tell, and therefore were not well prepared after the military mission successfully removed Saddam and his regime from power. So I think it's not just a question of credibility, I think it's a question of competence, and that increasingly will be clear. And it is hard to understand why leading figures in the administration, such as the Vice President, continue to make some of the same claims months and months, not only after the invasion, but after David Kaye and his inspectors went into Iraq. So looking backwards, we have some serious questions to ask. You know, why did the administration start down this road when they did? I think to give them some element of fairness, they did believe that these weapons were there, and they did believe that Saddam could pose a threat, and they had other obvious agendas at work as well. But now, why are they resisting discovering as much as we can about where we went wrong and what the mistakes were? They have stonewalled and dragged their feet with the 9/11 Commission. They have been unwilling to conduct the kind of internal examination that Ronald Reagan did after the horrible bombing in Beirut that cost several hundred of our Marines' lives. Reagan had an independent commission, had somebody from the Carter administration on it, and they reported within 5 months. And it let the chips fall where they may. This administration will not engage in that kind of self-critique. They never can admit they're wrong, and it is a troubling attitude to try to confront when it is tied to an ideological persuasion that argues for preemptive action, argues for unilateral action, which I don't think is in the best interest of America or the best interest of the world. So we need to be both looking backwards and looking forwards. How do we get to the bottom of what we were told and how the information was used and what are the flaws in our intelligence system, and then going forward, how do we fix it, because we shouldn't make the same mistakes again.
Well, I don't know if these folks up here in Massachusetts read books, but this book, Living History by Hillary Rodham Clinton, is not only a tremendous bestseller, but I'm told it's the best-selling political autobiography in all history. And it's going to come out in paperback in April. And, of course, people read this book with lots of agendas going in. I mean, people are just anxious to see the book. One of the agendas, I think, is that you're an icon for all American women. I think I think so. I think lots of American women. You don't think so?
Yeah, I think so.
You think there are women on the right who don't identify with you?
Oh, yes.
Is that right?
And elsewhere, yes, that's right. That's fine, though.
No, but I think it's true. I think women, it's my experience, across political stripes, tend to look up to you because of your personal experiences. They think what you went through with your husband in the White House, which is another reason they bought this book. They were looking for all the gossip. That they see in you someone who's got some gumption, you know, that you stood up there in a tough time. But you don't think that's true. You think you're such a polarizing figure that conservative women don't like you.
Oh, I don't know one. I don't have any information on that.
All right, we'll stay away from it. So you're going around, and you had book signings. I think you had like 40 book signings around the country. So tell me about that experience. What was it like?
It was wonderful. And, you know, when you write a book, you have no idea whether anybody but your family and friends will buy it or read it. And I was so overcome by the positive response, and I loved the book signings because there were just every kind of person you can imagine, you know, lined up there. And I had so many poignant and heartwarming encounters with a lot of the people who came. I had an older woman outside of Detroit tell me she'd never bought a book in her life before, you know, and that was very moving to me. I had a young man in Portland, Oregon, ask me for absolution, and I said, you know, what for? And he said, I voted for Nader, and I said, you need absolution. Hopefully he won't make that mistake again. So it was an incredible panorama of Americans and feelings and opinions, and just I could not have had a better experience. In
Nobody comes up to you and gives you hell and says, I can't believe what you did. And
well, there were some protesters outside, but I don't think they wanted to buy the book.
Oh,
so,
what were they protesting about?
Oh, they were protesting, I think, my very existence. There's a fellow who occasionally shows up wearing a devil costume, and I always wave at him, you know, say, how you doing? But that was very minor. I mean, most people were extraordinarily kind to me.
Now, as I said, one thing that people bought the book for was gossip. So how's your marriage?
You know what? I'm in a position where I no longer have to answer that question.
There you go. All right. That was good. So we have lots of questions here from the audience, and a lot of them have to do with shifting roles from being First Lady to being a U.S. Senator. Mrs. Clinton, do you think you're more influential in your role as Senator than in your former role as First Lady?
Oh, that's a hard question. You know, the First Lady position is, as you say, a role. It's not a job. It doesn't have a job description. There's no handbook you're given when your husband's elected president. But it is a tremendous honor. And it gives the person in that role an opportunity to speak out and work on behalf of issues and causes that she believes are important. I mean, what Mrs. Kennedy did on beautification and the White House and historic preservation was just extraordinary. And what Mrs. Johnson did on Head Start and, you know, planting wildflowers in the byways of our highways. You can go through all of these women who were my predecessors and see that they tried to do the best job they could, given who they were before they arrived in the White House, to support their husband and give him the kind of unbiased ear and response that everybody in that position needs to help their country. And I think we all did the best we could under different circumstances. And so I hope that in those 8 years I was able to not only start a few programs like Save America's Treasures and work on behalf of foster care and adoption reform and many other issues I was concerned about, but to some extent try to symbolize the changing roles of women, because when I came to the White House, I was the first baby boomer woman. I was the first who'd worked her entire married life. And I had a common experience to many women who both work outside the home and work inside the home and try to balance the two. Being in the Senate is obviously different. There's a set of expectations. You have to vote and go to your committee meetings and take care of your constituents' needs. You're one of 100, which is an extraordinary honor. And so I see it as influence and impact in very different ways. But I feel obviously very fortunate that I've had the chance to serve in both capacities.
Here's a question about politics. It says, Mrs. Clinton, why do you think the country is so evenly split between red states and blue states, given what the questioner says is the abject failure of the current administration?
That is in part because a lot of people place these so-called culture issues at the very top of their list about what they're going to vote on. And it matters deeply to them, and I respect that. And so they are inclined to believe that the Republicans, particularly a Republican president, is sort of on their side in how they see the world. And then there is a residue of concerns that Democrats are not, strong enough on defense and are not willing to take on many of the tough issues that people are concerned about. Now, I think that some of that is fading because there are a lot of questions and concerns about this president and the decisions that he has made and the consequences of those decisions. But there are, some states that have been reliably Republican and others that have been reliably Democrat for many elections, which is why so many elections come down to a relative handful of states. And that's what you'll see again this year, where if the country is divided, you can take out those states are going to go Democratic and those states are going to go Republican, and you're left with the so-called toss-up states or swing states. And so you'll see the candidates spending an enormous amount of personal time and resources trying to get one more than half of those who vote in those states. And that, I think, is the pattern that we've seen over the last several years. And what my husband tried to do when he ran in '92 was to demonstrate that Democrats would take on some tough issues like the culture of poverty, like welfare reform, like law enforcement. And so it was a Clinton administration initiative that put 100,000 police on the streets, which helped to lower the crime rate. The Bush administration is decreasing and even moving toward eliminating that program. So I think that the calculus is slightly changing, but it takes a while for that to, make itself felt in the electorate.
Well, I was thinking that you're exactly right, but I was thinking on the left there are also sort of litmus test issues like abortion. So abortion becomes one of those cultural divides. Gay marriage is another one. How are you dealing with the gay marriage issue as a U.S. Senator from New York?
Well, I'm absolutely against the constitutional amendment, which I think is a very bad precedent. And I've been heartened by a number of my colleagues, my Republican colleagues, who are also against the amendment, who take seriously the awesome responsibility of amending our Constitution. So I'm hopeful that this will not be brought up in the Congress, because I don't think they have the votes right now, and therefore it will be left to the states, which is where it should be. You know, the states have traditionally made decisions about marriage, and you know, it may be a little messy, but the states are working that through, and the states are making decisions about laws and constitutional amendments and attitudes regarding marriage and civil unions, which I think is absolutely appropriate. So I would hope we don't see the federal constitutional amendment brought up.
But on the specific issue of gay marriage, what do you think? Do you think that gay people should be allowed to marry?
Well, I support civil unions, and I think that civil unions provides the kind of protection and benefits that are really appropriate and necessary.
Here's another question. It says, for young people interested in public service, Mrs. Clinton, where do you see the biggest areas where a young person or anyone can make a difference?
Well, I would hope that we would inspire more young people to become involved, because the young voters, 18 to 25, are the least likely to show up and vote. And that gives free rein to those of us who are a lot older to ignore the future, because most of the votes I cast are more about the future of those young people than my own future. So I think that educating oneself about issues, volunteering for a campaign, following the news, those are all things that are absolutely open to young people, and I would urge anyone of any age really, but particularly our young voters, to take up that opportunity to see the political world in an up-close and personal way. I also think that there are certain issues that are going to be important issues, hopefully by next year when we have a new administration. The environment, for example. You know, the administration has stubbornly refused to acknowledge that climate change is a problem. And now there's a report out of the Pentagon that points out the national security implications of climate change. It's getting harder and harder to ignore, but the president will do it. He will ignore it between now and the election. This is an issue that we have to deal with. So the more young people could organize around an issue like global warming and forcing us to contend with CO2 emissions and become a force for that politically, and really make such a presence known about that issue, to make it a voting issue, you would begin to get the attention of those who are on the other side, because most political candidates sort of look at this in a very unemotional way. Is this an issue that people will actually vote for me or against me on? And if it is neither, then I'll go do what I want to do. If it is, then I better be careful, because I may create opposition on the opposite side. So I'd better watch my step. And we have to help all of our citizens come up with ways of making issues like climate change, which a lot of people's eyes glaze over, a voting issue. And if we can do that, then you'll see the political system more responsive.
Well, here's another question, again from a young person, along the same lines of the former question. It says, this year's AmeriCorps program was cut to 30,000 members. Congress has passed legislation to raise AmeriCorps to 75,000 next year. What is the Clinton vision for national service? How many Americans should serve in AmeriCorps annually? It comes from Aaron Marquez, a City Year Corps member.
Well, I love City Year, and I am very proud of the AmeriCorps initiative from the Clinton administration. It was obviously modeled on President Kennedy's Peace Corps initiative, and it was intended to give young people, and not so young, but mostly young people, a chance to serve in America, and for those who were low income to earn some help toward tuition for college. And actually more people have right now served in AmeriCorps than have ever served cumulatively in the Peace Corps, because it did grow during the 90s, and it took in a lot of the people who wanted to serve, and it was very exciting. This administration has done two things. You're right that they originally, for all kinds of reasons, allowed AmeriCorps to decrease in number, and now we're trying to build it back up. But they're also moving away from supporting some of the most successful programs, like City Here, like Teach for America. And they are looking to support different programs and many faith-based programs. So the whole future of AmeriCorps, the nature of AmeriCorps, is really up for debate. And I'm hoping that we can not only save AmeriCorps, but save the participation of groups like City Year, which really led the way for AmeriCorps, which showed how it could be done and have really changed the lives of so many young people.
One more question. It says, with the current Republican administration strategy of focusing the election on war and security, not jobs, how do the Democrats plan to take back the White House? So they want you to be a political strategist here.
Well, I think that the first threshold that any candidate for president has to cross is security. Even during peaceful and good times, people have to be able to envision this person as commander-in-chief and have to feel comfortable with that before they can go on to another issue. And that may not even play out at a conscious level of debate, but it is very much the way most voters approach this issue. So I think that we have a very good candidate who absolutely crosses that threshold and meets whatever those criteria might be, and who's in a position then to raise questions about the policies followed by this president. And those policies of credibility and competence in waging the war on terror are a legitimate subject for debate during the presidential campaign. So my husband has a saying that Americans sometimes want someone who's wrong and strong rather than weak and right. So we've got somebody who's right and strong. And that will give us a tremendous advantage going into this election. At the same time, we know that for many people, the economy and health care and education and the future of the courts and the environment and energy, all these other issues are critically important. And so once having crossed that threshold, Senator Kerry will be free to debate and critique where this president is taking our country economically and every other way. So I think we're in a very strong position. And I'm very optimistic about this campaign, because everywhere I go, people are expressing deep concerns. And it's not just Democrats, it's independents and moderate Republicans about the way decisions are made in this administration, about the failure and refusal to provide information, to respect the democratic process, the arrogance that is a hallmark both at home and abroad, and the fact that we have a lot of very difficult decisions ahead of us, and this is an administration filled with people who think they already have all the answers. And that is a little disconcerting to a lot of Americans. So I think we've got the makings of a vigorous and successful campaign. And I don't think there's been a more important election, because if we continue down the path we are on for 4 more years, we will not recognize our country. And I say that with absolute certainty.